Hello everyone, I'm really happy to be with you tonight for the second Webmardi of the year. Last time we had a talk on push notification with Nico, and this time it will be a bit different. We will have another a talk about CMS, which is based on Symfony. Before we start, I'd like to present you the Webmardi for the one who don't know who we are. Basically, the Webmardi is an association which run meetups in Romandy on the west part of Switzerland. We run meetups every first Tuesday of each month. We have about 10 to 12 talks a year. Depend. Sometimes we do also barbecue, stuff like that. But yeah, well, with COVID, we can't do that, so it's a more online event. The team is composed of Camille, Nelson, Kevin, and myself. So we all four people organize these meetups. The meetup is sponsored by Leap and Antistatic. They help us with all the materials, and also when we do physical events with the apero, and also help us to get some location when we do physical events. We also have partners, JetBrains and Smashing Magazines. Oh. For the agenda tonight, we're going to have the talk, and then you will be able to ask questions through the YouTube chat or on Twitch. We'll be moderating those, and we will be asking those questions to the speaker at the end of the talk. So if ever you have any questions, just put it in the chat and we'll moderate them. For tonight, we welcome Thomas Schedler. Is one of the guy behind Sulu CMS. Hello, Thomas.
Hi, nice to meet you. Nice to see you.
Nice to have you here tonight. So I won't take much more time, and I will let you do the presentation.
Good. So then I'm switching to my presentation mode. So I guess I can start now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. So let me introduce myself. So I'm Thomas. I am the co-founder and CEO of Sulu, which is the company behind the CMS, which with the same name. I have a strong development background. So I do web development for more than 50 years now, mainly in PHP, Symfony, but also in front-end technologies like React, for example. And obviously, we need some database caches and searches to achieve or to fulfill the requirements to build a decent CMS. I'm really into open source, and if you're interested in my opinion, you can follow me on Twitter or send me even an email. I guess my GitHub account I need to remove from the link the next presentation, because as co-founder and CEO, I don't develop that much anymore. I'm more into presentations or doing consulting reviews and stuff like that. And short introduction to the company, which provides professional services around the open source CMS and was founded in 2018. We are really dedicated to solve content management issues, and the Sulu itself emerged from a web agency called Massive Art Web Services. Massive Art and also Sulu are located in the, let's call it center of Europe. I know Swiss is also in the center of Europe, but we are in the western part of Austria, near the Lake of Constance. but operating generally worldwide because they are open source and it's possible to distribute that everywhere. So that's the background. And as I mentioned, Sulu is quite a young company, but the agency behind that is nearly or more than 20 years in the market. It was founded in 1997 and was initially a digital agency. So always a CMS was a topic. In the early days, that wasn't open source, so it was a closed source proprietary agent CMS, which I think back then a lot of people had and developed. And somewhere around 2005, I joined that company, and we moved into the open source space. Around 2008, we developed the first version of the Sulu CMS. Back then, it was called Sulu with Z, and it was also based on the Zen framework back then. So that's kind of the switch we did then in 2000, around 11, I think we started with the development and with a kind of really a fresh mind and kind of starting over with new technology. We switched to Symfony, so from Zen to Symfony back then, and it was heavily also influenced by some Leap developers back then. I think David Buchmann and Lucas Smith are quite familiar in that area, and they at that time they developed something called the Symfony CMS, and from our point it was quite interesting to see that development back then, but we were kind of missing a really nice admin interface and a really great user experience for the developer and also for the content manager. So for the developer, the CMS was really nice, but the admin UI didn't fit our expectations, and so we really started over again and tried to do that then in a really more professional way. So to be clear, in the initial days where Sulu 2008 were kind of developed, it was a side project. It was kind of developed within client project. It was open sourced, but there was not really a management about the community, around the community there, that was not managed like open source projects should have been managed. And as we decided to move on and do another technical iteration, obviously we screened the market and had a look at the different CMS out there, and there are kind of two hearts in our mindset. So there are two important areas. One is the technology, so the being up to date, having a modern stack, evolving all the time, but also having a really great UX and user experience for the content manager. And based on our location, we have different requirements to the CMS. So multilingual was quite important, but also multi-portal is quite important for our clients back then as Massive Art. So that all came to starting Sulu as really a separate department in Massive Art, and then in 2018 we moved that out from Massive Art, so it's now a separate company. So what is Sulu itself? Sulu itself, we initially struggled also a little bit with the term CMS, so we called us CMF, which was again confusing because there was already the Symfony CMS. And then now, when time was going on and we added more features, obviously we were a complete CMS in the end of the day, but I think we are more a content management platform. So if you think about a CMS, you have some traditional functionalities in mindset, and one big difference to other CMS that we are really fully based on a full stack Symfony framework. So we are not only using some components. So Sulu is like Symfony installation. So if you start a Sulu CMS, you're going to use Composer to create the project, to start the project, and you have kind of a Symfony installation. And it should, if you are a Symfony developer, it should be quite, you should be used to the folder structure and where everything is in the place. And as I mentioned, Sulu is really built for businesses. So there are things in place which are like multilingual, multi-portal, different workflows for drafting and publishing content. that smaller websites didn't need, and then maybe Sulu is not the right choice for you. As already mentioned, Sulu is 100% open source. We really try to manage our community, work together with them, get a lot of feedback, being fully transparent about everything we do, and rely on feedback from our community. That's really a crucial part in our daily business. So we have a quite active Slack channel, and if you want to get some help or some advice, join the Slack channel. You really find a lot of information there, and helpful people are in our community. Some numbers about the community, maybe not that important, but as we already exist for some years now, Sulu itself, we have about 22,000 commits in the core repository, about 1,500 GitHub stars. That's in the PHP world, okay, but in JavaScript it would be really a lot. 400,000 downloads for packages, and as I mentioned, our Slack channel is really quite active, and we have nearly 2,200 Slack users in our channel. Over the years, we did more than 356 releases. So yeah, try to release in a regular basis. I think that slide is also quite interesting because I want to kind of split the CMS market in different areas and try to explain where we see ourselves and where we see where we differentiate to other CMS systems. And we have there this comparison of bicycle, cars, trucks, and also super tankers. I know that nowadays maybe not the best analogy when it comes to sustainability, but I didn't find a better one. If you have one, please send it to me and give me I'm welcoming any advice to have a better comparison, which is not based on cars or trucks. But anyway, with a bicycle, you can repair it yourself. You can drive to work, and I love driving by bicycle to my office. But still, the reach is limited. And then the next level of CMS, when we look at the market in our perspective, is like there are cars. So you need to have a certain driving license, and maybe you cannot repair everything yourself. So then you need to have an agency in place which helps you to get started with that, and deployments and extending, adding stuff. And if it gets more complicated and you really need advanced driving license, maybe that also nails down that, for example, Sulu is really based on Symfony. So you should have some knowledge about Symfony that you really can leverage Sulu. And that's quite important, I guess. And so you need to have some specialized in place, but then you have the freedom to configure and add a lot of stuff and fulfill all your requirements from your projects. And on the far right, there is this kind of super tanker enterprise, even difficult to turn, but can do a lot of crazy stuff. So we see ourselves in the truck market, being the one who is able to carry a lot of stuff, still being open source. And normally on the right side, the super tankers are not open source anymore. So when to use Sulu, and we try to educate really that Sulu is not the choice for every project. So if you are maybe a Symfony developer and you have already experience with Sulu, you can do small side projects with Sulu or small communication websites. But in general, it makes more sense if you have a complex brand and corporate websites, some news and media portals. You need to integrate external data, maybe some bespoke e-commerce solutions which you're not able to handle with the standard shop solutions, and things like that. That's quite important to know, and normally we really educate so that you are aware of what Sulu is and what projects are Sulu for. Having a look at the basic building blocks and the elements from kind of feature point of perspective, but also adding some code details to show you some insights about Sulu. So as I already mentioned, we are really fully based on Symfony. So we are not using any components. We are really using the full stack framework, and we really try to leverage all the Symfony features and all the Symfony foundations, designs, when it comes to events, when it comes to services and all that stuff. So Symfony is our really base and also our driver to kind of walk further and be where we are right now. So then I think the most important block is obviously the content management part, and that's where the Sulu magic starts. So we provide a full content lifecycle, creating, editing, drafting, and publishing content in really a consistent and intuitive UI, so that the content manager should be able to manage the content quite easily. We have kind of really old school form-based management of data or content, but you still have the live preview to see what you kind of get, so see what you are editing. And versioning is also part of the core, so that's really important. And now we come to some really Sulu specific terms. So in our case, we have the web spaces are a term which is quite important in our case. A web space represents a single content structure, so a page tree, and should represent the page at itself, some parts of the navigation, and the hierarchy of the structure. In that tree, we try to also, or in that tree, we have so-called the dimension of languages. So the tree should always be consistent over all the different languages you are going to manage in your web space. And a key feature or core feature is also to be able to manage multiple of these content trees within one installation. So if you have to manage different target group or different appearance, different websites in one agency or in one corporation, you are able to achieve that with multiple web spaces. So now diving into the code a little bit, I need to have, confess, we love XML files. Maybe not we, but at least I think XML is really good if you're going to do more than just simple key value configuration. So if you're composing new stuff, for example, a web space XML definition file looks like that, and it includes all the important parts when it comes to configuring such a web space. So adding a new web space is as simple as adding a new file in this directory, defining the key, which should be unique, obviously, for the installation. Also defining the localizations you need, like the languages. And the localization always needs a language, but could also optionally have a country. So for Swiss, you have the possibility to have all these Swiss dialects you need. And also one really important part in that XML definition is how you detect the language from the URL. So that's the last line in the screen. You can see that there is this example.com localization prefix, but there are a lot of possibilities. You can do some kind of fancy subdomain locals, languages, placeholders. All the SEO requirements are kind of possible with that setup. And there I will also point to one really crucial point, or one of our important rules, is that we prevent to have any configuration in database. So all the things a developer is going to do is in source code and is normally under version control. So the UI itself, the administration interface, is only built for the content manager. And there is no kind of Drupal site builder area in the administration interface. So developers are working in code and using XML, for example, to compose such things like web spaces. There are not only web spaces for building content or managing content, because a web space, as I mentioned, is a tree of nodes, of pages, and has its limitations when it comes to really mass content management. So there are two additional content management features, like the article bundle, which is a separate bundle you need to install. So if you're familiar with Symfony, you know there is this concept of bundles, and you can install different bundles to extend the standard Symfony, standard Sulu installation. Regarding that, for example, we didn't invent some plugin features, or you are not able to install plugins via the UI. We're really using the Symfony ecosystem and using bundles for extending the Sulu administration interface, the Sulu features, and to add new features to the system. So the article bundle is nearly the same like the tree of content management, but it's a flat list of content. So you can compare that more to the Drupal, and the web space tree you can compare maybe to type of 3, which also has this tree aspect of content management. And then there's a third area which are snippets, and snippets are reusable content fragments across web spaces. So if you have the same content on different pages, but you don't want to manage it over again, you can reuse snippets on that places. The main difference between snippets, article, and pages is that snippets don't have a URL. So snippets are not accessible, or you can't access a snippet content without embedding that in a page or in an article. These are the 3 main areas when it comes to content management. And obviously we need some kind of templating, and that's kind of same for all these 3 areas. You have 2 pieces which are quite important when it comes to content management, and these 2 pieces when it comes to templating, sorry. And these 2 pieces are, one, the definition is an XML file. So you define based on your design, on your design briefing, on your requirements, the form for the content manager. And the content manager uses that form to manage its content. So you have multiple templates, and he can change templates for each page. And on the other hand, based on this XML, where you define the structure of the content, you have also a Twig template, which is kind of doing the interpretation and the HTML rendering. So let's have a look at that as well. Again, it's under version control. These are files in your project. That's again XML. So you define a key which should be unique for the installation. You define which Twig template it should be used for render the content. You have the possibility to define a controller, a cache line time for a certain type of template, and then you start over with all these properties. I'm going to not too detailed in that area because we have a lot of content types. So they called, like, these property types are, in our case, content types. There are a lot of around, and a lot of simple, like text line, text areas, image selection, media selection, but also some advanced one like blocks or smart content. If you're really interested in that, please see documentation. So, but at least you have now a feeling how you're going to structure your templates. And then the rendering is quite straightforward. So you manage your Twig files again in your repository, and you get a content variable where you have all the defined properties which were in the XML now available in your rendering engine. And here it's quite important to point out that Sulu doesn't provide any front-end technology. So it's really separate. It really separates the concern. So we do more like a content data management, and you get this data, that content in the Twig template. And regarding front-end, like giving you an advice on which CSS framework or how you should organize your CSS or JavaScript, or you need to add a certain JavaScript library to your front end, that's not the case. So you are really completely free to whatever front-end stack you prefer to use in the front end. It's even possible to buy a template and only fill in the gaps where you define the content in the end. So it's up to you what you are really want to present to the end user, to the HTML, to the website, to the response. Obviously, there are asset management included in a content management system. There's a central asset management where you upload all your files, all your media, all your PDF downloads. You can organize them in folders hierarchy, and these are all available over all the web spaces you are in the installation. So it's kind of central pool for all the media files. It's important to add the note that there is a versioning for documents and assets, and we do some or we do automated resizing and optimization of images. So based on your design and the definition you get from your designer, you're going to again have a configuration file where you define the different image formats you need for your website, and then Sulu is going to re-render or going to create and render the image formats you need based on the first request. So the first request may take a little bit longer. After that, the files are cached in the file system and are not anymore using Sulu or PHP to render the images. So the first request generates the image, caches the images, resizes the image, and then caches it. And after that, it's a file hit in the file system of your web server. So that should be quite straightforward regarding images. Let's having a look at some other areas of the content management system. There is obviously quite important some SEO fundamentals. So integrating analytics keys, adding your own script tags is something which is built in, obviously. Again, for example, you define only the structure for your template, but every page and every article has also additional fields and for SEO semantics. So there are separate tabs in the administration interface for every SEO or for a lot of SEO features you need. There is a quite powerful URL management in place, so they are all speaking URLs. And as you're going to change the URL, the system will keep the history and will forward you to the latest version. There's also the possibility to add some custom URLs, so like landing page URLs, short URLs, which point to a certain page in the tree. And there's an additional bundle which you can install to manage all the redirects. There you can upload redirect if you're doing a relaunch. That's quite important that you have kind of a set of redirects from old URLs to your new website. I'm going over that area in a little bit short time because I want to show you some more insights about how you can extend Sulu in the end of the day. But there is one area which is quite important and we are kind of proud of because we are one of the open source CMS which allows you to do personalization. So you can define target groups within the system, and based on the target groups you can also, or to the target groups you can also add basic rules how a visitor is kind of converted to a certain target group. That could be an entry page, that could be a region, that could in general be the browser type. I don't know if it makes really sense to detect the browser, but there are maybe areas where it makes sense. And then you can target that or you can display matching content for the target groups based on the visitor. It's really a nice feature. In our experience, it's a lot of people requesting that, but then lacking a little bit the content and for the different target groups. So we have some projects which are using that, but not that many. But I really love it, and it's really a powerful feature. If you have different target groups, you have different content to provide to them, and you want especially if you want to kind of keep them on the page. So the forwarding content, like things which could be interesting for you, is something which is, if it's personalized, it really adds value. So let's dive into custom business logic, and I need to check my clock. I hope I'm in the time. It's going to be a little bit into Symfony basics because, as I mentioned, it's really Symfony, and it's really, we are not hiding anything. So it's kind of a reminder how a Symfony requests flow. So you have the request. It hits the front controller, which is the index PHP nowadays. The kernel gets booted. It asks the router if he knows the controller, which is going to be instantiation. The action is called, and in the action there are some services called, some models fetched from the database, and in the end a fuse is rendered and a response is returned. So that's not something which shouldn't be, at least for Symfony developers or PHP Symfony developers, it should be quite familiar. What's the difference between a Symfony installation and a Sulu installation is that we change the default router with the Symfony CMS chain router. And the first router, which is in the priority list of the chain router, is the Symfony default router. And the second one is the dynamic router, which looks up URLs in some kind of in the database and returns them. So As you can see from the picture, because it's stolen nearly from the Symfony documentation, everything you do in the Symfony world, like adding a separate controller, defining a separate rule, and returning something, is higher priority and will always kind of work. So in that case, Sulu is not really doing a lot of things. It's analyzing the request if the a certain web space is matching, but that's all. Then the Symfony route hits, and you're kind of off to your Symfony world. So that's the easiest way to kind of add your business logic in the Symfony way you are used to it. Obviously, there are cases where you want to mix content from the content management system with logic from a separate API or whatever you need to do, which is not managed in the admin UI. And as you see, if the dynamic route is matching, or if the Symfony route doesn't find the route which is defined in the Symfony area, the dynamic router tries to look up the route in the database. And if it looks up the database and it finds the route, it also provides which controller and which action it should be instantiated and called. And that's exactly the place which we already have seen in this XML file. There we have the controller, which is by default instantiated for matching that route with a certain template. So an easy way to also extend the standard Sulu behavior with a certain business logic you want to add is adding your own custom controller for your own business logic. So then you have your own controller. We recommend to extend our existing base controller, so because it helps you to kind of handle the load and the structure interface is general, the interface for the structured content you get. There are also some kind of preview things you need to consider. So we recommend it, but you could implement everything you own. And as you see, the second argument of the render structure is array, which is a kind of key value thing. So that key is going to end up in your Twig template, and with that key you can access whatever service, whatever data you need, and forward that to your Twig template. So that's quite a powerful way to kind of include business logic you're going to implement within a certain template. There are other areas from the Symfony world you already know, and you should be looking at if you want to extend the system with your Symfony knowledge. So there are events. I'm not going into that deep, but as a reminder, there are Symfony events, there are doctrine events, and you can listen to them. And there is one quite powerful document manager, which is kind of the layer who does all that storing and managing of the content, because content is quite difficult to store. It's not really something you want to have in a relational database because it's more like a document, but still have hierarchies and relations. So there is this document manager in place which helps to store and find documents, and that is throwing a lot of events. So for example, if you want to have a mailing going on as soon as some page is going to be published, that's more or less the code you need. So you implement an event subscriber, you're going to register that form, register that service, and tag it that the Sulu document manager event subscriber knows that there is a service which needs to be invoked when a page is published. And for example, here we're going to send an email. That's quite simple. And I know that not the latest versions of Symfony and especially the Swift mailer is going to be replaced, and I need to update that code, but it still works, and it's an example how easy you can hook into the event. And last but not least, the service container is really the most important thing in Symfony in our area, because we use the service container to kind of control your application. And it's really our foundation to extend and customize Sulu installations. We heavily rely on the Symfony container to register new events, adding new navigation points, adding new content types, extending existing content types which are in place and have different interfaces to provide data from different pools. Or in the end, even you can override services. Obviously, it's not recommended, but with the service container in place, you have kind of really a powerful system to extend and customize to your needs. And that's exactly also the reason that there is no plugin system. There is the Symfony world, and we try to really stick to the Symfony way how things are working, and also trying to adapt from release to release. Last but not least, we need to deliver content, obviously, in a content management system. And by default, as you already have seen, we use Twig as rendering engine, but there are different possibilities. And we also use Sulu in a headless mode where we deliver JSON or XML, which is quite easy to achieve. If you're going full headless, we recommend to use our Sulu headless bundle, which is an add-on which you find on our GitHub repository. But in general, because the separation between data and representation is so strict that you are able to get out the data in any format you are looking for and any format you really need the data. So that was kind of the overview about the feature and some technical insights. I want to show you now the system architecture in a high-level description. So we have obviously some kind of storage abstraction. In our case, any SQL-based database will work, and we have a hybrid setup. I think that's quite important to notice. So we're using the PHPCR, which stands for PHP Content Repository, for storing all the content which is in the system. So pages, articles, snippets, these are content areas, and content storage is used for that. So that is stored in the PHPCR, and everything else, which is more traditional relational based, is a doctrine ORM entities. Then there is Symfony, and we use Symfony quite heavily, and some part of the Symfony CMS, especially the CMS router. We added a lot of Sulu bundles to add our ideas of how to manage content. And then there is this separation of these two contexts. Nowadays, back then there were two kernels, really two kernels in a physical way. Nowadays it's a context, so the kernel knows in which context it is running. So to be really precise, that's really the only difference to a standard Symfony installation. So if you start with a Composer Create Symfony or a Composer Create Sulu project, you will see that they look really similar, but in some cases you see differences in the configuration where it's suffixed with website or admin, and not all services are registered for the admin and not all services are registered for the website. So that dates back to the initial Symfony 2 world, where it was okay to have two kernels, and there were also some issues included if you, for example, in the backend, obviously we need a firewall, and we don't want to have a firewall on the website. And back then, for example, always a cookie was instantiated if you have a firewall configured in the web space. There were some issues back then also with the container. They are all resolved nowadays. We might switch to one kernel in the future, but that's something you need kind of remember if you start over with Sulu, that there are two kernels. And again, the admin kernel is our administration interface, which provides the REST interface, and nowadays a single page application written in React. So with the 2.0 release of Sulu, we switched to React completely. And your website. So your website is really your application, and every code you write there is your website and your web application you're going to achieve, you're going to develop. Last but not least, or maybe least, last and least, I show you some references from projects we did over the last year. And one quite big project we did for a Swiss-based open-air cinema event organizer, which is in business for more than 30 years now. It's based in Zurich, Basel, and Genf, and it's a quite big open-air cinema. And if you know some things about ticket selling or selling tickets, then it's not the straightforward shop you would use for that. So it's quite quite a challenge to sell tickets and don't sell tickets twice and things like that. So you need to be really careful when developing such systems. And that was the reason why we really took the pace to implement that kind of based on Symfony and not reuse a traditional shop system for that, because it behaves differently. Selling tickets and selling on stock t-shirts is something which differs in details quite heavily. That was really a success, a really great project. We sold in the first year over 100,000 tickets. We sold 15,000 the first 4 hours, and we have several APIs which we are connected. There are a film database where we import data from the film database. There is an access system which controls the access to the area, and there are some Power BI connections to really monitor the sales, monitor how things are going on. That's quite interesting and really powerful showcase, which shows that Sulu is more than a CMS. It's really a platform where you can develop such systems. A nice integration we did with Silius. Maybe some of you already know Silius is kind of e-commerce, or it's like a twin of Sulu, but in the e-commerce world. So it's also Symfony, full stack Symfony based. It's really has the same spirit, and we do some projects together where we kind of do this, I would call it content commerce project, where content management is quite important. In that case, it's a German special interest magazine, which do some product reviews. And while they are doing these product reviews, they want to do some product placement, obviously, and sell, for example, in that case, olive oils. And that's a headless integration with the e-commerce framework from Silius. That's a really nice integration as well. And the last showcase or reference I want to show is, again, sadly German, but a recipe portal from a German book provider, book author, and they is kind of heavy on advertisement. So they have something about nearly 7 million users a month and more than 40 million page impressions. There are 40,000 recipes online, and that's kind of, I think, one of the biggest Sulu installations we as Sulu help to run. So I think I did it in nearly the time which was suggested. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to answer some questions.
Thank you, Thomas, for the talk. Thank you for tonight. We have a few questions for you, and I will take it. Remove the screen. So we're just together now. So yeah, the first one is, so you answer it mostly, but you said you rely on Symfony CMS bundle. Except the router, what did you use from it?
Nothing. To be honest, we use some tests which are there in place, but nothing really. Initially, we also, I think there was the auto bundle which generates some routes, but as I mentioned, the most important part is really the chain router from the Symfony CMS, and I think, when I remember correctly, also Drupal is now using that, and other CMSs out there are using that as well. I think that's the most important piece of the Symfony CMS. The blocks, for example, are quite similar to our snippets, but again, we have this kind of approach where you define that in this XML file, because our target is kind of to also have this separation, that it should be convenient for front-end developers. So XML is a markup language, and HTML or Twig is also quite straightforward. Then you have JavaScript and CSS, and if you get more, it gets more complex, and you need to have some more Symfony knowledge and PHP experience. You can split that in the team. So that's not always the case when it comes to Symfony CMS bundles, so that then you initially always get into the Symfony world immediately. That makes sense, obviously, but not really in our case. So Symfony CMS is now only the router, when I remember correctly.
Okay. Oh, thank you. I have a question following that one. Is how did you manage translation and routed routes, if you have?
Yeah, we have. So that's the power of the PHPCR. So PHPCR provides us a tree of nodes. PHPCR in general comes from JCR. So there is also a reference implementation in the Java world, and we have a separate tree for routes, which is kind of also doing this magic of old routes redirecting to new routes, and the content are separated in that tree. So these are two separated trees, and route trees are kind of linking and referencing to the content. And so we have translated and routes, and they are stored in the PHP-CR.
Okay, oh, great. A long one now. How is it simple to customize a specific content page with code? For example, defining a page as a listing of articles and load kind of code snippet inside it. For example, you have a page, you want that page to be a listing of articles.
Mm-hmm.
How do you code the block of, how do you call a partial controller inside that page without coding a controller?
There are different options how to achieve that. We would recommend to use one of our content types. I know the term content types is often used differently in other CMSs, but in our case, a content type is the smallest unit. So in general, when you define a property, you give it a name and a type. So that's the content type. And we have something called smart content, which is doing kind of this aggregation. So in that smart content, the content manager is able to kind of build a query. So he can choose the place where he wants to fetch from, kind of filter by tags and categories, doing some limitation, doing some sorting, and then the system automatically kind of fetches the data and gives you in your Twig template, and then you iterate and prepare the output. On the other hand, if smart content isn't capable of all the requirements you have, you obviously can do some custom controller and fetch the data from whatever you prefer or however you need.
You can't embed partial controller. If you have something too complex, you have to create your own controller.
Yeah.
And so you can hook inside the routing translated system, I think.
You can obviously hook into the system with different events and services.
Yeah.
But in general, there is no partial controller for a content type because a content type itself has some logic in it. And maybe you can achieve that by also adding a separate content type. That's, again, possible. A content type is nothing more than a Symfony service. So register that as a service in the container. And maybe you need to add some JavaScript code because it behaves differently in the form. But that's also possible. So you could, I wouldn't call that controller. So that's kind of a separate content type with a separate logic.
Okay. Oh, thank you. It's perfect. The next one, Jan asked us, would you say that Sulu is managing EAV entities regarding the storage, for instance?
So Sulu is, as I mentioned, because we are storing in PHP CR, and PHP CR is a storage abstraction layer for not having to use some kind of EAV or whatever. So that's the advantage, and also some kind of downside, because you have this hybrid of PHP CR and Doctrine entities. But PHP CR is a schema-less storage, so we can throw in everything. It's more or less like Elasticsearch or MongoDB. You don't really have to define a hard schema, and so it's quite easy. If you add a new property in the template XML, it's stored immediately. And on the other hand, we are now also playing around with different solutions. With the newer SQL systems have some JSON field types, where you kind of have this hybrid of relational and document databases for some projects. So because PHP CR lost some traction, to be honest, and we have to look into maintaining PHP CR or looking for a solution that we can get rid of this hybrid world. But it still works good, and especially when it comes to storing content, because that's the idea behind PHP CR, is storing content and not having to think about any weird abstraction on top of a relational database. I hope I understood that question.
Yeah, I think you answered the question. If not, Jan, feel free to just ask more context or in-depth answer. Another one it's mine. How do you deal with image resizing with crop, specific crop or focal points?
Mm-hmm. So Sulu provides the possibility. So the content manager is able to define one crop for each format or a focus point. So we have 9 areas. It's not really precise, but at least you can have some definition of focus point. And this is kind of fallback mechanism. So if you define a specific crop for a certain format, then that is used. Then it tries to look up if there is a general focus point defined for that image, and else it's going to center.
Okay, yeah, obviously. Cool, thank you. Yeah, it's mine kind of ubiquitous. So you talk about web species. Does it mean that there are no translation system and it works in parallel, or you have something that translates entities? I didn't really understand how works this translate system. If it works in the field based or in the content based, or if it's just different workspaces.
Okay. In general, everything we provide, so every entities which are included in the system, have translation. Have translation. So all the media data are translatable. All the description, copyrights, and whatever. And that's also something for PHP-CR is solving for us. So you can think of like dimensions of languages, but on the same node. So if we again using the term node for page, that's typically in the PHP-CR world. So all the translations are stored on the same node, and it's more like turning it. So if you have, and there we can do easily fallbacks. So if you don't want to translate everything, we can fetch a different language, but you don't manage different trees for different languages. It's always the same tree within one web space, and you define all the languages for that web space. Other web spaces, so if you have multiple web spaces or multi-site, multi-portal installation, you don't conflict. So each web space can define its own languages and how many he needs. So if you have a web space which only needs English, then it's totally fine, and others needs more. So they are really separated.
Yeah,
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense perfectly. Yeah. And it's a tricky question. Just why did you use XML over YAML for the configurations?
So I think it's really a personal opinion in some kind. I did a lot of XML and XSLT back then in the early days, and I really like how readable XML are, and I like that you have a schema, and I know there are different areas, and for example, IDE is supporting you nowadays as well, but you have a schema, you have XML definition, and we do have a lot of YAML for configuration, but I think building something like doctrine entities or building web spaces, composing templates is more complex and should be really more readable. Yeah, from our point, it's easier. There obviously can be contribution that we can write it in a different language. And maybe we're going to move that to the Symfony configuration because it's now based on our own reader, and it's cached in PHP in the end, so we don't interpret the XML all the time, obviously. Maybe we can achieve that to move that to the Symfony configuration, and then it would be up to the choice, or to your choice, that you can write that in XML or YAML or even in PHP pure. That question comes a lot.
Yeah. A question about cacheability. How does it work with snippet? Does it work with cache tags?
Exactly. Snippets, assets, but also we have a quite decent contact management area. So we use that also for user management, but also, for example, if you have a contact person on the website, you can have a central contact management solution for that. They all provide tags, and initially we are heavily using the Symfony HTTP cache for simple sites, and then using to Varnish, and Varnish obviously has cache tags, but I think half a year ago, something like that, the Contao guys developed also a feature, a separate storage for the Symfony HTTP cache, which is file-based and supports tagging, and that's really awesome. So that's our cache tags, and based on that, we can expire. Yeah, that's based on HTTP basic HTTP cache.
Yeah. Again, an edge case question, or kind of case question. If I want to use Sulu and I have to create a breadcrumb and stuff like that, does Sulu provide some helper or tools to help me to get the current path, parents, active trails, children, stuff like that.
So we don't really transfer the tree or move through the tree, but there are different helpers to provide navigation structures, and based on that navigation structure, you can traverse the tree up, or and then you can provide breadcrumbs quite easily. So there are different twig helpers to provide that functionality.
And the last question we have tonight, it's how can we be involved into Sulu CMS?
Yeah.
Where do I go if I want to contribute, or if I want to create some documentation? Or...
Obviously, GitHub is the place to be for contributions. But I really encourage you to join our Slack channel. I think we have a really welcoming community and spirit. It's a small one, but a really lovely one. And I think GitHub, and obviously also the Slack channel is the place currently to be and to get involved. And we really love to hear feedback anyway. So any documentation is on GitHub. Obviously, we use GitHub issues for tracking the issues, doing the pull requests there. So yeah, it's I don't know, it's obviously, but it's really near to the Symfony, to the Symfony world as well.
For the documentation, it's also on GitHub. It's a documentation.
It's docs.sulu.io, but it's also on GitHub.
Perfect. Well, I think I asked you all the questions, and nobody asked for more context. So we will continue with the end. Thank you, Thomas, again for the talk.
Thanks you for having me.
See you soon, and keep safe.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. So I will try to share the end by myself, presenting, sharing screen. Okay, so I think you saw my screen. Yeah. Okay, let's go. So what's next? The next Webmardi will be in March, 2nd of March. It will be Yasin Bakiri, and we will talk about how developers can work with designer and how a designer explain and works with animations. So it will be very, very interesting. I work with Yasin time for times. I'm not a front-ender, but still I work with him. And it will be very, very interesting to see how designer communicates animation with developers, because we all see in all our projects how it's difficult to create great animations and make it live and make it great. So yeah, looking forward for this talk on 2nd of March. I hope I will see all of you there. Tiny slide for our sponsor Leap. They are hiring developers, so feel free to go to the leap.ch/jobs. They are hiring PHP developers, front-end developers, and digital analysts. So yeah, feel free to go there, fill out the form, and yeah, try to be hired. Thank you all for tonight. I hope you enjoyed the talk, you enjoyed the presentation of Thomas, and I hope see you again for the next Webmardi. Subscribe to our channel if you want to see all those videos. All our videos are free on our channel, and all the live are still available on YouTube. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night, and see you soon.